The Challenges of Confronting ISIS in Indonesia, presented by speakers Sidney, Jones and Nava Naranaya. Today's seminar is co-hosted by the Asia Research Centre at Murdoch University, the Indonesia Institute and the Perth US Asia Centre. A special welcome to Murdoch University's new Vice-Chancellor, Professor Ava Leoninen, who has taken time out of her busy schedule to be here. Your support and interest is very much appreciated. Sidney is currently the Director of the Institute for Policy Analysis of Conflict based in Jakarta. Prior to that, she was, for over a decade, up to 2013, with the International Crisis Group, and before that, held positions with the Ford Foundation in New York, Amnesty International in London, and Human Rights Watch in New York, where she was the Asia Director from 1989 to 2002. Sidney holds a BA and an MA from the University of Pennsylvania and was awarded an honorary doctorate from the New York the New School of New York. Sidney is unquestionably among the most expert and incisive of analysts on security in Southeast Asia, especially Indonesian Islamic terrorist movements, but also a range of other conflicts in the region. This includes analyses of separatist conflicts, ethnic struggles, and Islamic radicalism in general. In addition to her various reports and book, Making Money Off Migrants, the Indonesian Exodus to Malaysia, which was published in 2000, she has been a prolific contributor on issues of security and human rights to the region's and the world's most significant media. This is Sidney's third talk here at the Asia Research Centre at Murdoch University, the first being as far back as 1995. So welcome back, Sidney. Our other speaker, Nava Naranaya, is an Associate Research Fellow with the Centre of Excellence for National Security at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. She obtained her Master of Arts in International Relations with honours and Master of Diplomacy with distinction from the Australian National University. Nava's research focuses on terrorism and radicalisation in Indonesia. She has published on the topics of jihadist online discourses and narratives related to the Syrian conflict and online counter-terrorism. Among her current projects is work on the involvement of Indonesian jihadists in Syria and its global and local dimensions, the evolving use of the internet by Indonesian extremists and terrorists, and the adaptability of local jihadist groups. The way we're going to proceed from here is with Sidney talking first, and then without me interrupting again, she will hand over to Nava. Sidney will talk for around about 30 minutes. So I'll see you again at the end of those two presentations, where we'll have questions and answer time. Thank you.
Hi everyone, it's lovely to be back at Murdoch again. It's like an old family reunion now. I should make one correction. Nava is now with me at IPAC, so she is very wisely decided to leave RSIS in Singapore and join the team. So what we want to do today is tell you a bit about how things have changed in Indonesia with the advent of ISIS, and we still call it ISIS because that's how Indonesians refer to it, even though whether you call it ISIL or IS for the Islamic State, we're still talking about the same phenomenon. So just a reminder of the general outline of things. People are getting more worried about intersections across Southeast Asia. So the idea that people in Indonesia could follow old routes up through East Kalimantan to Mindanao, go across North Sulawesi to Mindanao, that some of the old ties in Sabah in Malaysia could be reactivated. And when we talk about developments in Indonesia with ISIS, in addition to the strongholds on Java, it's also important to remember that we have Poso in central Sulawesi. We have a constellation of jihadi characters in Sumbawa, in Bima here, and there's a legacy that's very important to the story from a terrorist training camp that was set up in Aceh in 2010. So just so you have an idea of the geography. And the bottom line is that the news isn't good. We probably have more activity among jihadi groups than at any time in the last decade. And we're seeing new alliances, new constellations of characters. We're seeing for the first time Indonesian extremists being more responsive to developments outside their own borders than inside. It's always been the case, even at the height of the Afghan conflict and after the invasion of Iraq, that it was local drivers that were much more important than international developments. The emergence of the Syrian conflict and of the caliphate have changed this. So we're not talking about a kind of new manifestation of the old Afghan conflict. This is different. Also, we're seeing the reactivation of an older generation of activists that we thought were long gone. We've had people who have been dormant and inactive in extremist movements for more than a decade be inspired by ISIS to be active again and join with younger colleagues. And for the first time since 2009 and the hotel bombings, foreigners, thanks to the ISIS agenda, are back on the hit list. Now, the government is taking the problem seriously, particularly since the Jakarta attacks. So we're seeing a push for a strengthened counter-terrorism law. It's got a good side and it's got a bad side. The good side is that there are many crimes for which there was actually no legal tool to deal with. For example, joining a terrorist military group overseas wasn't a crime under Indonesian law, and it would be if this strengthened law was passed. On the other hand, there are some provisions for preventive detention which are downright dangerous and I think won't end up in the final law. We're seeing more funding and personnel for some of the elite counterterrorism units of the police, although that may be to some degree in jeopardy by a recent death in custody that's caused outrage in Indonesia. We're seeing deployment of the TNI, of the military, in prisons to guard high-risk offenders. Again, good side and bad side. The good side is that more personnel for prisons is a good thing because they're vastly understaffed. The bad side is putting the TNI in any counterterrorism role has consequences. We're seeing a greater willingness to prosecute people for traveling to Syria to join ISIS even before the counterterrorism law is passed, and that's generally a good thing. And we've got an experienced and professional head of the National Counterterrorism Agency just in the last couple of months, and that was really, really and truly badly needed. But even with these changes and with these initiatives by the Indonesian government, the problems are still enormous. Just take you back for a moment to give you an idea of how things have changed. In 2001, that was the height of Jemaah Islamiyah. That's the organization most Australians are familiar with because that was the organization behind the Bali bombs. It was the gigantic elephant in the room, even though there were lots of other smaller organizations. And the story over time to 2010 was the gradual decline of Jemaah Islamiyah, the fragmentation of different groups, and then in 2010, an alliance of the non-JI groups to put together this training camp in Aceh. And we began to get a division between JI, which had decided not to be involved in violence any longer, and to focus on rebuilding the organization, and the organizations that were still committed to violence in Indonesia, and that included an organization set up by Abu Bakr Ba'ashir called JAT, and we'll hear more about that. But one consequence of the breakup of that camp in Aceh and the fleeing of many fugitives was the emergence of a new training center in Poso, in central Sulawesi, which had been the focus of a intense communal conflict between Muslims and Christians in around 2000-2001. The communal part of it was settled with a peace agreement in 2001, but we had a number of extremists stay on in the area. And after the Aceh training camp was broken up, they regrouped under the leadership of this man named Santoso, who calls himself now the commander of the ISIS army in Indonesia. He has been on the wanted list since 2011. He is now the target of one of the biggest manhunts in Indonesian history, with about 2,500 police and military searching the jungles of central Sulawesi to find him and about 35 followers, including for the first time the first 3 women combatants that we've seen on the jihadi scene. His organization is now called the Mujahideen of Eastern Indonesia, or MIT, and he has basically turned this into an alliance of his people in Poso with that group in Bima that I mentioned, together with an old Darul Islam faction in Makassar. And as he was turning his group into almost a mini insurgency in the hills outside Poso, we began to see the first Indonesians leave for Syria because of the way that the conflict in Syria just captured the imagination of Indonesians. It was both the idea that they would be able to take part in the Islamic version of Armageddon, the final battle at the end of time, which according to Islamic prophecies would take place in greater Syria. But they were also attracted by the idea of helping Muslims who were being attacked by a Shia commander or Shia leader in the form of Bashar al-Assad. And there were other factors that attracted people. So unlike Europeans or Australians or others from the Middle East who have gone to ISIS, there are no push factors. Indonesians aren't going because of persecution, discrimination, poverty, or other forms of injustice. They are going because they want to join ISIS, because of attraction. It's all pull factors, not push factors. And we began to see, once people were in Syria, they began to send messages home urging their friends and colleagues to join. One consequence of the focus of people going to Syria from existing jihadi organizations was that there was almost no terrorism in Indonesia. So for 2014 and 2015, we had very little activity from the Indonesians who were normally committed to violence at home, because so many of them were focused just on hijrah, on getting to Syria. But much has changed by early 2016. For one thing, it's become harder and harder to get to Syria because of better controls on the Turkish border. So the message to Indonesians who want to go to Syria is, you can still try, but if you can't get there, try to go to Poso and help Santoso and the Mujahideen of Eastern Indonesia. But if you can't do that, find other ways of waging war at home. So that means more intensive violence. We've also seen some organizations, particularly one called JAKI, which stands for Jamaah Ansar Khilafah Islamiyah, or the Partisans of the Islamic Caliphate, set up as a structure of ISIS in Indonesia, meaning that the people involved are more likely to carry out orders, kind of generic orders, to attack foreigners and to attack members of the coalition that are issued by the ISIS leadership than they would have been had there not been this structure. This was set up in November 2015. We're seeing some of the attacks in Europe capture the imagination of Indonesian jihadis, so that the Jakarta attacks, even though they were unprofessional and kind of pathetic, were nevertheless a deliberate effort to copy the Paris attacks of November. And we're seeing the emergence emergence of competing men from Indonesia in Syria, each of whom wants to win the recognition of the ISIS leadership. So that kind of competition is also creating a kind of lethal one-upsmanship to see who can do something in Indonesia that's bigger and better than the one before. In the case of Santoso, who is the target of this manhunt, there also may be a case of nothing to lose. He is now being pushed to the limit. People have been found starving because they can't get logistics and other kind of food supplies up there. People who are trying to reach Poso have been deterred by the concentration of security forces. So it may be that he orders some of his people outside Poso to try and undertake attacks because they have nothing to lose. All of these factors suggest that we are going to at least see more attempts at violence, even though the police have been successful in foiling a number. I should say that the other key factor that Nava will talk about later is the existence of encrypted messaging on telephones, because up till now, one of the key tools used by the counterterrorism police to follow and intercept plots has been intercepting mobile telephone networks. And if you have encrypted messaging on WhatsApp or Telegram, that's much different. So the contenders in Syria are now 4 people. They include, the most important is Bahrum Shah from the Jakarta area. He's the person who has the support of the ISIS leadership and commands the military unit of Indonesians and Malaysians known as Katiba Nusantara. He has also sent funds from Syria to the Philippines and to Indonesia for the purchase of arms for use in attacks in Jakarta, as well as for the purchase of arms for Santoso. His great rival is Abu Jandal, who accused him of corruption and of skimming off funds in Syria for the fighters. Abu Jandal was then, in a classic Indonesian counter move, accused of defamation by Bahrum Shah. He got imprisoned for about 2 months in Syria, but then let out. And when he got out, he set up a new military unit, which somehow has the protection of at least some people in ISIS, called Katiba Masharek. And many of the East Javanese in Syria have joined him. We think that the Malaysians are still mostly with Bahrum Shah. Then we have a third man who has basically not taken sides with either of these two, although he's closer to Abu Jandal. But he's a webmaster, and he has been using social media to urge people, not just in Indonesia, but also in Malaysia and Singapore, to do lone wolf attacks against foreigners or other enemies of Islam. And then we have this last person who recently appeared on a recruiting video, who's a really interesting figure. His name on the video was Abu Walid. We know him as Faiz. He was actually arrested in the Philippines in December 2004 in Zamboanga with money to try and buy arms, and except he was accused of possessing explosives, which apparently wasn't true. And it took from December 2004 to December 2013 to get him acquitted. So he was released by the Philippines government and almost immediately left for Syria. So he's somebody with good connections in the Philippines. He studied in Saudi Arabia, has excellent Arabic, had ties to Saudi donors at the time that he was using for to purchase arms and so on. And we think he's playing a critical role now, but we don't know exactly what. So this is how the situation looks today. On one side, we have an anti-ISIS group led by a newly reconstituted Jemaah Islamiyah, which still has affiliations to the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria called Al-Nusra. And JIMMI, a small above-ground advocacy unit that was actually also set up by Bashir in 2000, and a splinter group of JAT known as JAS. They're all anti-ISIS. In the pro-ISIS groups, we have these clusters that don't all coordinate, but are all supporting ISIS. So it includes JAKI, which I mentioned, led by this man named Aman Abdurrahman, who is the most dangerous ideologue in Indonesia, far more dangerous than Abu Bakr Ba'ashir, although temporarily there is an alliance between Aman and Ba'ashir, both of whom are now in solitary confinement. Around this JAKI, we have JAT, which has become incorporated into this coalition, and a couple of Dar al-Islam factions. A lot of the efforts to consolidate these groups have taken place in prison. We also have, and this constellation is basically loyal in Syria to Abu Jandal, to the guy who set up the rival military unit. Then we have constellations of other groups which the guys in Syria can call up and ask to undertake actions. So we've got a messy situation with lots of different groups that have pledged allegiance to al-Baghdadi and who are available for mobilization if you have the money and if you have the training. Many of them have links also to the Philippines, and many of them have also links to Poso. So we've got, for the first time, basically since the Camp Hudaybiyah and the training camps that JI had in the Philippines, we've got international linkages that are going to have ramifications for Indonesia. So basically, the different groups in Indonesia have these following characteristics. We've got groups that have their own contact in Syria. I mentioned a few of them, but we also have local ones. There's a group in Makassar, has its own people in Syria. They have their own ideological or religious leader. They have their own operations leader. They have their own sources of funding. Some of it is from outside, but relatively little. Overwhelmingly, the local groups are self-financed. We have a mosque or a school that serves as the headquarters for the group in question. We have some local organization that serves as the primary source of recruits. So that, for example, JAKI relies in West Java on the old JAT structure. It's just been a wholesale transfer. Whereas in East Java, the JAT people many of them have defected to, because they don't agree with ISIS. In each case, there is a prison connection, and many of the aspects of the January attacks were actually planned in Indonesia's maximum security prison, meaning maximum security doesn't mean very much. And in most cases, we have a link back to Poso.